7 years. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 7 years. Not 7 weeks, not 7 months. 7 years of my life. 7 years of choosing one man again and again, every single morning when I woke up beside him, and every single night when I watched him leave for events I wasn't invited to. 7 years of being the person who knew every version of Ethan Hale that the world would never be allowed to see. The version who cried the first time his father called him a disappointment. The version who ate instant noodles straight from the pot when he was stressed. The version who reached for me in his sleep, even when he pretended in the daylight that reaching for me wasn't something he needed. I knew all of him, and he let me know all of him. That was the cruelest part, looking back. He didn't hide himself from me. He only hid me from everyone else. There's a particular kind of love that teaches you to shrink. It doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, the way shorelines erode. You don't notice the land disappearing until one day you're standing somewhere that used to be solid ground and realizing the ocean has been taking pieces of you for years. Ethan didn't ask me to shrink the first day or the first month. In the beginning, it felt like a reasonable sacrifice, the kind of thing you do for someone you love when the world isn't ready, when timing isn't right, when the circumstances demand a little patience. Be patient, Kelvin, just a little longer. I heard that sentence in so many different forms over 7 years that it stopped sounding like a request and started sounding like a fact of nature, like gravity, like something I had simply agreed to live with. The penthouse on Riverside. I want to describe it to you because I think the penthouse is important to understand if you want to understand what my life actually was. It was beautiful. I need to be honest about that because I've spent the last several hours trying to decide whether the beauty of that place was a gift or a cage, and I've landed somewhere complicated. It was 4,200 square feet on the 32nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows facing the river. A kitchen with marble countertops that I cooked on every night I was home. A study where I managed Ethan's private finances, organized his personal schedule, handled the quiet correspondence that his official PA wasn't supposed to see. A bedroom with sheets that cost more than most people's monthly rent, where I slept alone on the nights Ethan had appearances to maintain, which, toward the end, was most nights. That penthouse was mine, and it was not mine. My name was not on the lease. My name was not on anything. I existed in that space the way a secret exists. Present, real, significant, and entirely deniable. Ethan Hale, for those who don't know, and I imagine most of you do given who he is the CEO of Hale Meridian, one of the most prominent commercial real estate development companies in the country. He built that company from a medium-sized family inheritance and an extraordinary amount of ambition. And I say that without bitterness because it's simply true. Ethan is brilliant. He is strategic in a way that borders on art. He understands people, understands what they want to see, understands how narrative shapes power. He turned himself into a brand, not just a businessman. And part of that brand, a carefully maintained, deliberately curated part of that brand, was his eligibility. The handsome, unattached CEO, the most desirable bachelor in any room he entered. Investors liked it, the press loved it. It suggested a man whose only commitment was to his work, which meant his work would always come first, which meant your money was safe with him. I understood this. I'm not going to stand here and pretend I didn't understand this. He explained it to me in the second year of our relationship with the kind of calm, rational clarity that I now recognize as manipulation dressed in the language of practicality. He told me that his public image was a business asset. He told me that revealing our relationship would create complications. Questions about his judgment, potential alienation of conservative investors, a media cycle he couldn't control. He told me it was temporary. He always told me it was temporary. And because I loved him, because I was 24 years old and deeply, completely, foolishly in love with him, I said yes. I said, of course, I understand. I'm not going anywhere. I'll wait. What I didn't understand then, what I am only truly understanding now, standing in the back of the Whitmore Grand Ballroom on what should have been the most significant night of our 7 years together, is that when you tell someone you will wait and they never give you an expiration date for the waiting, they are not asking you to be patient. They are asking you to be invisible. They are asking you to be convenient. They are asking you to be the kind of love that costs them nothing and requires no courage whatsoever on their part. I was his shadow. That is exactly the right word for it. I was the part of him that only appeared when conditions were right, when we were behind closed doors, when we were in spaces he controlled completely, when no one who mattered was watching. I was the shape of his life that he moved through privately and presented nothing of publicly. And shadows don't have demands. Shadows don't have needs. Shadows don't ask to be seen in the light. I thought, going into tonight, that 7 years was enough time served. That was the word my brain had started using recently. Served, like a sentence, like time I had earned through. I thought that our 7th anniversary would be different because he had promised me. 3 months ago, sitting across from me at the kitchen island with his coffee cup between his hands, that by the end of this year, things would change. He said the company was stable enough. He said the right moment was coming. He looked me in the eyes and he said, "I want to stop hiding what we have. I want people to know." I believed him. Again. After 7 years of believing him, I believed him one more time, because I am the kind of person who chooses stubbornly and almost self-destructively to believe in the people I love. Tonight, he chose the Whitmore Grand Gala as the occasion to announce something significant about his personal life. He told me 3 weeks ago, said it would be a milestone evening, a night people would remember. He was vague about the specifics, the way he sometimes was about things he hadn't fully decided yet, or so I thought. He told me I could attend. He said, and I remember this precisely, "I want you to be there, Kelvin. I want you to see it." I thought he meant he wanted me to witness his courage, to see him finally do the thing he'd been promising for 7 years. I got dressed tonight like I was preparing for something. Not the gala itself. I'd been dressing for Ethan's events for years, always impeccably, always as if someone important might notice, even though the point was always that they didn't. But tonight felt different. I wore the navy suit he'd had made for me in Milan 2 summers ago, the one I'd never had an occasion to wear because most of his events were ones I watched from the outside or attended anonymously in crowds. I took my time. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment and thought, after tonight, this ends. The hiding ends. I took a car to the Whitmore Grand, alone, the way I've always gone everywhere when it concerned Ethan's world. I arrived early enough to find a position near the back of the ballroom, a habit of 7 years, knowing how to be present without being prominent. The room was extraordinary. The Whitmore does these things beautifully. Crystal chandeliers, round tables with white floral centerpieces that probably cost $1,000 each, 500 guests in black tie who all knew each other in the way that powerful people always seem to know each other. I got a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, and I stood in the soft space near the back wall, and I watched the room fill up, and I thought, soon. I thought, soon I'll be on his arm at one of these instead of standing at the edge of it. I watched Ethan arrive. Even now, even tonight, after everything, I can't pretend that watching him walk into a room doesn't do something. He has a presence that is genuinely magnetic, not manufactured, not simply the product of expensive tailoring and good lighting. He carries himself with a certainty that is almost physical, like a warmth you feel before you see the source. I have loved him for 7 years, and I have watched him walk into hundreds of rooms, and that thing he does, that particular quality of his attention when it sweeps a room, it has never stopped meaning something to me. He looked good. Of course, he looked good. He was wearing charcoal gray with a white shirt, open at the collar the way he prefers, formal enough for the room and individual enough to signal that he sets the terms. He moved through the crowd easily, pausing to greet people, laughing at the right moments, his hand finding shoulders and arms with that practiced warmth that is one part genuine and one part performance, and I can never fully separate which is which. He didn't look at me when he came in. That wasn't unusual. We had protocols for these situations. We called them protocols, which is a word I'm now deeply ashamed of having accepted as normal. If I were present at an event he was attending, I didn't approach him, he didn't acknowledge me, and we would reconnect afterward. Protocols. Like I was a procedure, like our relationship required a manual. So I stood at the back of the room and I watched him work the crowd, and I felt genuinely a kind of tenderness for him in that moment. The kind of tenderness you feel when you know someone more completely than a room full of people does, and you carry that private knowledge like something precious. I thought, in an hour, I won't have to stand at the back anymore. The speeches began around 9 o'clock. There was a program tribute to charitable initiatives that Hale Meridian had funded, a brief retrospective of the company's growth over the past decade, remarks from 2 board members who spoke about Ethan in the hushed tones of people describing something close to sacred. I've heard speeches about Ethan at many events. I used to find them gratifying in a complicated way, the pride of loving someone the world admires, mixed with the ache of not being able to claim that love publicly. Tonight, I found it hard to focus on them. I was waiting for the part that mattered. He took the stage at 9:47. I remember because I checked my watch, not out of impatience, but out of some part of me wanting to mark the time, wanting to have a precise before and after. The room settled the way rooms do for him. That attention thing again. Even 500 people, most of them accomplished and powerful in their own right, found themselves orienting toward Ethan when he chose to hold a microphone. He smiled at the room. He thanked the organizers, the board, the charitable partners. He said some things about vision and community and building things that last, the kind of language that has always come easily to him, and which I have always privately helped him refine for exactly this kind of occasion. Some of the phrases he used tonight were ones I'd suggested in our conversations at home. That struck me only in retrospect, later. At the time, I was still waiting. He said he had a personal announcement to make, an important one. My heart did something very physical in my chest. I put my hand flat against my sternum, a quiet gesture, self-soothing, the way I sometimes do when emotions become too large to simply contain internally. I thought, this is it. This is the moment.
He reached off stage, and a hand took his. The person who walked out beside him was not someone I recognized immediately. It took a moment. The lighting, the distance, the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing creating a kind of perceptual delay, the way the brain sometimes refuses to process information that doesn't fit its existing framework. A young man, well-dressed, composed, smiling with the particular brightness of someone who has been coached for exactly this moment. He was perhaps 25. He had the look of someone whose role in this narrative had been prepared well in advance. Ethan held his hand in front of 500 people. 500 people who had never, in 7 years, seen Ethan Hale hold any hand. He spoke. I heard the words from my position at the back of the room, heard them in the way you hear something when your body has already understood it before your mind catches up. He introduced the young man by name. He used the word fiancé. He said they had met 18 months ago at an event in, and here his voice did something warm, something practiced, something that I have heard directed at me in private for 7 years, and that from the first moment he had known. He said, "From the first moment I knew." I have heard Ethan say those words before, not at a gala, not in front of 500 people. At 3 in the morning in the penthouse kitchen, when he thought I was asleep and I wasn't, when he came and found me sitting on the counter, and he stood in the doorway and looked at me for a long moment and said, "From the first moment I saw you, I knew." 7 years ago. I was 24 and he was standing in a doorway, and his voice was low and private, and I believed it with my entire self. He said those same words tonight to someone else, in public, in front of everyone he had ever refused to say them in front of when they were true. I stood at the back of the Whitmore Grand Ballroom, and I did not move. The room applauded. The sound was warm and genuine. People love a love story, especially when attached to a powerful man who has been called unattainable for years. I watched 500 people celebrate a declaration that I felt in the center of my chest, like something being very slowly, very precisely removed. And then Ethan looked up from the young man's face. His gaze swept the room, that natural, practiced sweep of a man comfortable commanding spaces, and for just one moment, one single, clear, unmistakable moment, his eyes found mine. He looked right at me.
And he didn't blink. He didn't flinch. There was no flicker of guilt, no momentary compression of the jaw, no micro-expression of recognition that something had just gone catastrophically, irreparably wrong.
He looked at me with a calm that was so complete it was almost abstract, and then his gaze moved on. He moved on. Like I was furniture, like I was part of the back wall, like 7 years of my life contained in a body standing 40 feet away from him in a navy suit he chose for me was simply not a thing that required acknowledgement. The applause continued. There is something that happens to you, I think, in the moments after a true and complete betrayal that nothing in ordinary emotional experience prepares you for. It isn't the hot, immediate devastation you might expect, the tears, the collapse, the vocal expression of grief. That comes later, sometimes, for some people. For me, in that ballroom, standing with a glass of sparkling water I had forgotten I was holding, what happened was something much quieter and much more terrifying than that. A coldness. Not metaphorical coldness, something that felt almost physiological, a kind of temperature drop in the center of my chest that moved outward into my arms, my hands, my face. A settling, like the moment after an earthquake when the ground stops moving and you realize the structure around you has fundamentally changed configuration, and you are now standing in something that will never be what it was before. I understood, in that coldness, with a clarity I had been avoiding for longer than I will ever admit out loud, several things at once. I understood that Ethan had known about tonight for at least 18 months. The timeline he announced, 18 months of a relationship with someone else, meant that while he was still sleeping beside me in the penthouse, still accepting my management of his private finances, still calling me at midnight when he was anxious about a board meeting, still eating the food I cooked and accepting the care I gave with both hands, he was 18 months into building an exit strategy. He had been constructing this replacement carefully and deliberately while continuing to allow me to manage his life. I understood, in that coldness, with a clarity I had been avoiding for longer than I will ever admit out loud, several things at once. I understood that Ethan had known about tonight for at least 18 months. The timeline he announced, 18 months of a relationship with someone else, meant that while he was still sleeping beside me in the penthouse, still accepting my management of his private finances, still calling me at midnight when he was anxious about a board meeting, still eating the food I cooked and accepting the care I gave with both hands, he was 18 months into building an exit strategy. He had been constructing this replacement carefully and deliberately while continuing to allow me to manage his life. I understood that the announcement tonight was not spontaneous. 18 months of preparation. The young man's composure, the ease with which he stood at Ethan's side, the way the room received them, this had been planned. The public revelation of Ethan Hale's personal life was not a courageous act of vulnerability. It was a transaction, a calculated business decision, like everything Ethan ultimately makes. The bachelor's image had served its purpose. Now, apparently, the married image was more strategically useful. And the person he had chosen to perform that marriage with had been selected for reasons that had nothing to do with 7 years of love in a hidden apartment. I understood that Ethan had told me to attend tonight, not because he wanted me to witness his courage. He told me to attend because he needed me to understand the new terms. He needed me to see it firsthand so there could be no ambiguity, no room for a conversation he didn't want to have. He brought me to the back of his own ballroom to watch him replace me, and then he looked me in the eyes and didn't blink because the message was, I know you're there, I know what you're seeing, and I need you to understand that there is nothing to discuss. That was the part that took my breath for a moment. Not the betrayal itself, or not only that, but the arrogance of it, the absolute unwavering certainty that I would accept even this, that after 7 years of accepting invisibility, of accepting protocols and patience and temporary measures, I would watch this happen and go home to the penthouse and wait for him to come home and offer me some version of an explanation that I would eventually, wearily absorb. He thought I would wait. He thought, even now, that I would wait. And here is what I want you to understand. The cold clarity showed me, standing in the back of that room, he thought that because I had given him every reason to think it. 7 years of evidence, 7 years of proving that my love for him was more durable than my self-respect. 7 years of accepting one more compromise, one more delay, one more promise dressed up as a reasonable request.
He had studied me the way he studies everything, strategically, carefully, with full attention, and he had concluded, accurately, based on the available data, that I would absorb this too. He was wrong. But he was not wrong because of anything he'd done differently. He was wrong because I had finally, in the space of 30 seconds of watching him hold someone else's hand in public, arrived somewhere inside myself that I didn't know I'd been traveling toward. I thought about the first year. I thought about being 24 and standing in the kitchen of a much smaller apartment, before the penthouse, before the empire had fully solidified, and Ethan was nervous about a pitch that could change everything for the company, and I stayed up all night with him going through his deck, finding the weaknesses, asking the questions a skeptical investor would ask, making him better. I thought about all the nights I had helped him prepare for things I would never be allowed to attend as his partner, all the quiet labor, all the private investment. I thought about year 3, when his mother was ill, and I drove 3 hours to a hospital in a city where no one knew me and sat in a waiting room for 6 hours because he needed someone who loved him to be near him. And when she stabilized and he came out to the waiting area and found me, he didn't say anything. He just sat down beside me and put his head on my shoulder, and I held the weight of him, and I asked for nothing. I thought about year 5. When the acquisition deal that would double the company's portfolio nearly fell apart because of a documentation error, and I was the one who caught it. Me, managing the private correspondence, saw the discrepancy in a contract attachment and flagged it, and the deal went through, and the public credit went to his legal team. And I made dinner that night, and we ate together, and he was happy and grateful, and I thought, this is enough. This is what love is, giving without needing the recognition. I thought about how many times I had told myself that loving someone well was its own reward. How many times I had constructed philosophical frameworks for my own invisibility to make it feel like wisdom rather than loss. Standing in that ballroom, I stopped finding those frameworks convincing. Because here's the truth that the coldness stripped bare. Love without dignity is not love functioning at its highest form. It is love in captivity. And I had been so committed to the love that I had agreed to the captivity without ever properly naming it as such. Ethan Hale did not love me less than I thought. I want to be honest about that too. I think, in his way, in the limited and instrumentalized way that powerful men sometimes love the people who are most useful to them, he did love me. He was real with me in private in ways I don't believe he was real with anyone else. But his love for me had always been conditional on my cost. I was valuable to him for as long as I remained low cost, emotionally available, professionally useful, completely discreet, and undemanding of anything that would inconvenience his public life. The moment the cost of keeping me would have exceeded the cost of replacing me, 18 months ago, apparently, when he met someone whose particular appeal aligned more neatly with his evolving strategic needs, the calculation had changed. I was never a person to him, not fully. I was an asset that had reached the end of its useful term. I finished the sparkling water, set the glass down on a nearby table with perfect composure, smoothed the front of the navy suit jacket. He was still on stage. The young man was smiling, the crowd was warm and celebrating, and none of them knew what was standing at the back of the room in a suit from Milan. I turned and walked out. I want to talk about what it feels like to walk away from someone quietly when the situation has every right to be loud. There's a version of this story where I cross that ballroom floor, where I make my way through 500 people and reach the stage and say something that ensures Ethan Hale never forgets this night for reasons other than the ones he planned. I won't pretend that version didn't exist as a brief, vivid possibility in my mind as I walked toward the exit. I thought about it. I considered it. For approximately 45 seconds on the lobby marble, I stood still and held the weight of that option. I put it down. Not because I was afraid. Not because I lacked the words or the composure or the standing to make that scene, but because walking into the middle of Ethan's event and making his betrayal into a public spectacle would have made me a footnote in his story. The scorned secret. The jealous ex who couldn't keep himself together. He would have managed that narrative beautifully. He's extraordinary at managing narratives. I would have been the instability that proved why he'd had to keep me hidden. I would have handed him the justification. No. My exit would be louder than a scene. My exit would be the kind of quiet that he would hear for years. I took a car back to the penthouse. The drive took 22 minutes. I spent those 22 minutes sitting very still, hands in my lap, watching the city move past the window, and conducting a very specific internal audit. What did I have that was mine? What was my position exactly in the material reality of this situation? Where did I actually stand? I had lived in that penthouse for 5 years. I had managed Ethan's private financial accounts for 4 of those 5 years, not as an employee, not with a formal arrangement, but because I was good with numbers, because I understood how money moved, because Ethan trusted me with the accounts that his official financial team didn't have visibility into. The household accounts, the discretionary accounts, the reserves he maintained separately from Hale Meridian's corporate structure for reasons of privacy and flexibility. These accounts were jointly accessible. He had made them accessible to me practically, not legally, not in the way a lawyer would define shared marital assets, but accessible in the sense that I had the credentials, I had the access, I had managed every transaction through them for 4 years. I also had the private correspondence, 5 years of personal communication between Ethan and a range of parties that his official PA had never seen, that existed entirely in the private email system I managed. Communications about financial arrangements that had not been disclosed in the company's public reporting. Communications about certain business dealings that had required discretion for reasons I had, over the years, come to understand more fully than Ethan perhaps realized. I had the keys to every locked thing in that penthouse, metaphorically and literally. When people ask me now what gave me the composure to do what I did next, I think the honest answer is this. The grief was real, and it was enormous, and it was there. But underneath the grief was something that had been waiting for a long time to be useful. A version of myself that I had been suppressing in the service of the relationship. A clear-eyed, organized, precise version of Kelvin who had been managing someone else's life for 7 years and had, in the process, become extremely capable. That version of me walked into the penthouse at 10:43 p.m., put the keys on the counter one final time, and got to work. I started with the practical, because the emotional was something I could not afford to sit down in yet. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it. The dinner I'd half prepared before the gala was still on the counter, covered, waiting for an arrival that was now beside the point. I looked at it for a moment. I had made his favorite, because it was our anniversary, because I had believed, walking out the door that evening, that we would have dinner together when the gala ended, and he would tell me how it had gone, and we would celebrate 7 years. I put the food in the refrigerator. I don't know why. Reflex. Care. 7 years of habitual consideration for someone who had stopped considering me 18 months ago. Then I went to the study. There are things I am not going to detail completely for reasons that will become clear in time, but I will tell you this. I was meticulous. I was organized. I was systematic in a way that would have impressed the version of Ethan who used to tell me I was the most competent person he knew. I accessed what I had legitimate access to. I moved what I had every right to move. I documented what needed documenting, copied what needed copying, and compiled what had been compiled over 4 years of managing a private financial and personal infrastructure that Ethan had trusted me with completely. He had trusted me completely. That trust was not something I was going to weaponize in a way that crossed into territory I couldn't stand behind. But there is a difference between weaponizing trust and simply removing the access that had been granted in the context of a relationship that no longer existed. I was no longer his private manager. I was no longer his hidden partner. I was no longer his shadow. And so the resources, the access, and the information that existed in my name or under my management, I was retrieving those with precision and purpose. The accounts that had been jointly accessible, the ones carrying funds that had been managed by and entrusted to me for years, I moved the portions I had legitimate claim to. Not everything. I want to be clear about that. I took nothing that wasn't mine to take, but I took everything that was. I want to pause here because I know how this sounds, and I want to be honest with myself and with you about the line between justice and vengeance. I spent a significant portion of those hours in the study asking myself, is this right? Is this the person I want to be? The answer I arrived at was this. For 7 years, I performed work, real, skilled, valuable work in the service of Ethan's private life, and by extension, his empire. Work that was never compensated, work that was never formally recognized, work that I performed out of love, and he accepted as one of the benefits of keeping me hidden and convenient. I managed the private correspondence through which several sensitive business dealings passed. I maintained the financial accounts through which a significant amount of discretionary capital moved. I was, in every practical sense, a private employee and life partner who received no formal compensation for either role, whose only remuneration was the roof over my head and the private affection of a man who had just announced his engagement to someone else on television.
What I took, I earned. What I retrieved, I built. The jewelry he had given me over 7 years, I packed it because it was given to me, because gifts do not ungive themselves when a relationship ends. The photographs I took, the ones that contained my face, which were not many because Ethan had been careful about physical evidence, but they existed, tucked in the back of the desk drawer where he kept things that were private even from me. I took those too, not to use, just because they were mine, because my face in a photograph deserved to belong to me. My clothes, my books, the small collection of objects I had accumulated over 5 years of living in a space that I had made into a home while knowing in some quiet part of myself that it was borrowed, I packed them into 2 suitcases and 4 boxes that I had the building's night concierge help me bring down to a car. I called a car. I made arrangements. The efficient, competent version of Kelvin that Ethan had benefited from for years was, in those hours, working entirely in my own service for the first time, and it turned out I was very good at it. The letter I left on the kitchen counter, I wrote it by hand. 3 sentences. I will not share the exact words because they were between him and me, and some things, even now, deserve that boundary. But the substance of it was this. I told him that I had been there tonight. I told him that I had heard everything. And I told him that whatever he had assumed about my response had been incorrect. 3 sentences. 7 years. I think the economy of that was appropriate. I was gone by 2:17 a.m. The gala typically ends at midnight, but Ethan has never left these events before 1. There are always conversations, always the inner circle gathering at the hotel bar afterward, always the performance of a life to sustain. I had, by my calculation, approximately 45 minutes before he would arrive home. I used 45 of them. I left with 14 to spare. I'm telling you this story from a hotel room. Not the kind of hotel room that connotes crisis, not a roadside situation, not desperation. I have resources. I have been careful for years, in ways that Ethan didn't entirely know, to maintain my own financial foundation alongside the life I was living in service of his. Some part of me, the same quiet, careful part that organized his accounts and noticed the contract error in year 5, had known, for longer than I admitted to myself consciously, that the ground could shift. And so I had been building something of my own in the margins, quietly, the way I did everything in that relationship, invisibly. I am in a good hotel. I have a room on a high floor. It is past 3 in the morning and I am not sleeping, which is not a surprise, but I am also not in pieces, which surprises me a little. I thought I would be in pieces by now. I thought the grief that I had held at bay through the hours of quiet action would come roaring in the moment I stopped moving. Instead, I am sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the city, and feeling something I haven't felt in a very long time.
Space. There is space in my chest where there used to be constant, low-grade management. The management of Ethan's needs, his schedule, his anxiety, his image, his private correspondence, his household, his carefully maintained secret. For 7 years, the background process of my mind was always running those programs, always half attending to what he might need, what was coming next, what needed anticipating, what I needed to prepare for. I went to sleep with it, and woke up with it, and lived my entire life inside of it, and I had come to understand that weight has simply the weight of loving someone, which turns out to have been inaccurate. The weight of loving someone and the weight of servicing their life are not the same thing, and they don't have to coexist the way I allowed them to. I am sitting here with that absence in my chest, not grief, not yet, though it will come. I know it will come. And I am trying to understand what it is, and I think it might be the first real breath I've taken in 7 years. The first moment that my entire self is oriented toward my situation, my next step, my life, without an entire secondary architecture dedicated to someone else's. It feels enormous. It feels terrifying. It feels like standing at the edge of something with no railing. It feels like mine. I am going to tell you something about love, which I have spent 7 years believing I understood, and which I am now beginning to understand for the first time. Love, real love, sustainable love, the kind that makes both people larger rather than one person smaller. Love does not ask you to disappear. It does not ask you to become a private fact in someone else's life. It does not ask you to perform loyalty in the dark and then be surprised when the dark is all you inhabit. I loved Ethan Hale with my whole self for 7 years. I gave him everything I had in the generous, wholehearted way that I believe is the only way I know how to love. Not strategically, not transactionally, not with one eye on the exit. I loved him the way I would want to be loved. I gave him a standard of care and devotion and patience and capability that, I understand now, I have never applied to myself. I have never been generous with myself the way I was with him. I have never been patient with myself the way I was with him. I have never believed in my own future the way I believed in his. And I think, sitting in this chair, in this room, in the first hours of a life that is entirely mine to navigate, I think that might be the thing that needed breaking. Not the love for him exactly, though that is broken tonight and I won't pretend otherwise, but the hierarchy I had accepted so quietly and so completely that placed his life above mine as a simple premise, that turned me into a function instead of a person. I wonder sometimes, already in these first hours, what the last 7 years would have looked like if I had applied the same devotion and capability to my own life that I gave to his. What I might have built, what I might have become. There are things I set aside, professional ambitions I let go dormant, relationships I let thin out because they complicated the demands of managing Ethan's private world, experiences I deferred because there was always something of his that needed attending to first. None of that was demanded explicitly. He never said, "Kelvin, I need you to give up your life for mine." That's not how it works. That's never how this kind of thing works. It accumulates. It settles. It becomes the shape of your days before you've noticed the original shape is gone. I am 31 years old. I say that to myself in the dark of this hotel room, and I feel both the weight of it and the possibility of it. 31 is not the end of anything. 31 is objectively very early. I have years and capabilities and a clarity now, bought at a significant price, about exactly what I will and will not accept from someone who asks for my love. I know now, with a precision I couldn't have achieved without tonight, what I require, what I deserve, what I will not negotiate away. I will not negotiate away being seen. That is the core of it, I think. That is the thing that all 7 years of invisible love was asking me to sacrifice, and that I can no longer agree to sacrifice. To be loved in private while denied in public is not a love story. It is an arrangement. And arrangements, however comfortable, however filled with genuine feeling, are not the same as a life. I want a life. I want someone who looks at me in a room full of people and doesn't blink, not because they are calculating the cost of acknowledging me, but because I am theirs and they are mine, and that is simply true, and they are not ashamed of it. I want to be someone's first instinct, not their best-kept secret. I want to be introduced, not managed. I want someone who is brave enough to love me in the light. Ethan was not that person. Ethan was, in the most precise possible sense, a person who kept me in the dark, and then, when the dark was no longer convenient, extinguished me without ceremony. And I will not spend another 7 years, another 7 days, another 7 minutes in the dark for someone who has chosen convenience over courage. There is one more thing I want to say, and it's perhaps the hardest thing, the thing that requires the most honesty. Part of this, a real significant part of this, is on me. I'm not talking about the decisions I made tonight. Those I stand behind completely. I'm talking about the 7 years that preceded tonight, the years in which I constructed an elaborate interior justification for my own erasure and called it love, and repeated it to myself so often that it had taken on the quality of fact.
When Ethan first asked me to keep our relationship private, I had options. I was 24 and I was in love, and the options felt less available than they were, but they existed. I could have said, I will be with you, but I will not be hidden. I could have said, I understand the professional complications, but I need a timeline. I could have said, I am a person, not a protocol. I could have said any version of those things, and if he had been unwilling to hear them, I would have had important information much earlier than year 7. I didn't say those things. I said yes because I wanted to keep him, and I kept him by agreeing to disappear, and then I spent 7 years slowly making peace with the disappearing because the alternative, acknowledging what I'd agreed to, what it said about how I valued myself, was more painful in the short term than the ongoing compromise. I am not blaming myself for being betrayed. What Ethan did tonight was his choice, made with full knowledge of what it would mean, and it is his to account for. But I am being honest with myself, here in this hotel room, because I think honesty is the only foundation for what comes next. I accepted less than I deserved, over and over again, because I was afraid that the full version of what I deserved wasn't available to me. I was afraid that the love, stripped of the secrecy, stripped of the arrangement, would disappear entirely. And that fear, that particular corrosive fear of losing what I already half didn't have, kept me compliant in a situation that was diminishing me every year. I will not carry that fear forward. I will carry the lesson, and I will leave the fear exactly where it belongs, in the back of a penthouse I no longer live in, on a counter beside a note written in 3 careful sentences, in the dark of a life I have walked out of. The lesson is this: I am not a secret. I am not a convenience. I am not a function to be outsourced when useful and discarded when expensive. I am not a shadow. I am not a protocol. I am a person who loved faithfully, worked diligently, and gave generously for 7 years, and who has now gathered all of that love and work and generosity back into himself and is standing in a hotel room at 3 in the morning on his 31st year of life with the full weight of his own value, finally clear to him. I am the most competent person Ethan Hale has ever known. He told me that himself, more than once, in the private hours. He told me I was indispensable. He told me that no one understood the architecture of his life the way I did. He told me at 4 in the morning when the company was close to a crisis that I was the reason things held together. He was right. And that competence, that understanding, that capacity, none of it belongs to him. It never did. It was mine. It was always mine. I simply loaned it to him for 7 years at no charge. The loan has been recalled. The city outside my window is just beginning its shift from night to early morning, the particular blue-gray that happens before the sky commits to dawn. I've been sitting here for hours, and I should sleep, and I will, soon. But first, I want to finish this. I want to speak the end of this story clearly so that I can hear it out loud in my own voice and know that it is true. Ethan Hale is going to come home tonight, this morning, to an empty penthouse. He is going to find the keys on the counter, the dinner in the refrigerator, and 3 sentences on a sheet of paper in my handwriting. He is going to do a rapid calculation, the way he does, and he is going to realize that the parts of his private infrastructure that I managed are no longer where they were. He is going to realize that the years of private correspondence and financial management that were entrusted to me have been carefully, legally, precisely retrieved. He is going to realize that the person he assumed would absorb this quietly has done the opposite of absorbing it quietly, has simply and completely stepped out of the equation. He may call. I expect he will call. I have already decided what I will and will not do when that call comes. I will answer it because there are practical matters that require resolution, and I am not a person who avoids necessary conversations. But I will not accept an explanation as a substitute for an apology, and I will not accept an apology as a substitute for accountability. And when those conversations are complete and what needs to be resolved has been resolved, I will wish Ethan Hale exactly what he deserves in his new public life, which is to say, I will wish him the same standard of love and loyalty and invisible labor that he gave to me, and I will let him discover what that feels like on the other end of it. But more than that, more than anything about Ethan, more than whatever comes next in that chapter, I want to talk about what I intend to do with myself now.
I am going to find out who Kelvin is when Kelvin's life is organized around Kelvin. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet. I have ideas, things I set aside, interests I let go dormant, a professional trajectory that I paused in year 2 when managing Ethan's private affairs began consuming more of my time than I had anticipated. I have skills that were built in service of someone else's empire that are now available to build something of my own. I have 7 years of experience navigating the private machinery of a major real estate development company, which is, objectively, a significant professional asset. I have a mind that notices things others miss. I have an organized and relentless attention to detail. I have the ability to remain composed under conditions that would destabilize most people, as evidenced by the fact that I watched the man I loved for 7 years introduce his fiancée in a public ballroom, felt the cold clarity settle in my chest, finished my glass of sparkling water, and left without disturbing a single floral centerpiece. I have, it turns out, a great deal to work with. And I have something I haven't had in 7 years: permission. My own permission, given to myself, to want things, to expect things, to occupy space, to walk into rooms not as a shadow attached to someone else's light, but as a source, as someone who belongs at the front of the room. That is the thing I want to hold on to most tightly right now, in the blue-gray of this particular morning, in the first hours of a life I am building from scratch. The permission. I am allowed to be seen. I am allowed to take up space. I am allowed to be loved in the light. I am allowed to be the first thing, not the kept thing, not the secret, not the convenience, not the protocol. I am allowed to be loved by someone who has enough courage to love me where people can see. And until that person exists, until I find them or they find me in the way that feels like something real and mutual and luminously free of shadows, I am allowed to be enough for myself. I am enough for myself. 7 years ago, that sentence would have frightened me, because I had constructed my identity so thoroughly around being enough for him that being enough for myself felt like a consolation prize. It is not a consolation prize. It is, I understand now, the prerequisite. You cannot give someone the full, genuine offering of who you are until you have first made peace with who you are, until you have sat with yourself in an empty room and found the company worthwhile. I find myself worthwhile. I find myself, honestly, extraordinary. Not in the self-aggrandizing sense, not as a correction to what was done to me tonight, but in the straightforward sense of someone who has looked at what he built in 7 years and decided that what he built was considerable. The qualities I gave to Ethan, the attentiveness, the care, the competence, the constancy, those are mine. They belong to me. They are the inventory of who I am, and the inventory is full, and it is good. Whoever has the privilege of my love next, whoever earns it, is going to receive something extraordinary. Not because I have been made extraordinary by loss, but because I have always been extraordinary and simply forgot to include myself in the accounting. I am remembering now. The city outside is starting to lighten. True dawn is coming. I have not slept, and I will need to eventually, and when I wake up there will be a long list of things to do, practical, legal, logistical things that require the competent version of me to show up and work. I will show up and work. I am very good at showing up. I will also, at some point in the next few days, allow myself to cry, because the grief is real and it deserves its space, and pretending it isn't there would be as much a disservice to myself as everything I allowed for 7 years. I loved Ethan Hale. In the best hours of those 7 years, I loved him with a depth and a specificity that I will not diminish to make tonight easier to bear. The love was real. The grief is real. And I will feel it fully, because feeling it fully is how I honor the parts of those 7 years that were genuinely good, and also how I move cleanly through them and out the other side. But I am not going to let the grief convince me that I am less than I am. I am not going to use the pain as evidence against myself. I am not going to look at what happened in that ballroom and decide that it tells me something fundamental about my worth. It tells me something about Ethan's fear. It tells me something about the choices people make when they value their image above their integrity. It tells me something about the gap between who he presented himself as and who he actually was. It tells me nothing. Nothing about who I am or what I deserve. I deserved to be chosen. I chose him first and completely and without conditions, and what he deserved was a love like that, freely and bravely given. Instead, he managed me. And management, however skilled, however considerate in its own way, is not the same as being chosen. Tonight, for the first time, I choose myself. I choose my own name spoken out loud. I choose my own presence in a room. I choose the version of my future where I am not waiting for someone else's courage to materialize before I can have the life I want. I choose mornings where I don't have to check someone else's schedule before I plan my own. I choose the particular, profound freedom of a life that belongs entirely to me, managed by no one and owed to no one, and shaped, from this morning forward, entirely by my own hands. He built an empire on the image of being unavailable. I am walking away from that empire with the knowledge of how it was really built and the tools to build something of my own, and 7 years of quiet, invisible, extraordinary capability that was always mine. He thinks the story ends with the shadow walking away. He doesn't know yet that shadows, when they step into the light for the first time, cast no shadow at all. They simply stand, illuminated, and entirely, completely, irreversibly themselves. He called at 2:54 a.m. I watched the phone vibrate on the hotel nightstand and I let it. Then again at 3:01. Then 3 times in rapid succession at 3:09, which told me he had arrived home and found the keys and found the letter and was now standing in the kitchen of that penthouse doing what Ethan Hale does when control slips, reaching for the nearest available solution. I had always been the nearest available solution. Not tonight. I turned the phone face down and slept better than I had in 2 years. He found me 4 days later. I hadn't hidden. Hiding was his specialty, not mine. He came to the hotel lobby with no security, no PA, no buffer, just Ethan, in a gray coat, looking like a man who hadn't been sleeping, which was the most honest he'd appeared in years. I'll give him that. The performance of humility at least cost him something cosmetically. I agreed to coffee because I am not a person who refuses necessary conversations, and also because part of me, the part that had loved him for 7 years, needed to hear him say it out loud so I could watch myself not break. He said it was for show. He sat across from me in a hotel cafe with his hands wrapped around a cup he wasn't drinking from, and he told me with remarkable composure for someone who had allegedly come to grovel that the engagement announcement was a strategic arrangement. That the young man, he actually used the phrase, the young man, clinical, distancing, was the son of a consortium investor whose partnership required a demonstration of personal stability and social alignment. He said it was a business decision. He said it meant nothing. He said he had planned to explain everything and that he had expected me to understand the way I had always understood. He said, "You always understood, Kelvin." And there it was. That was the tell. Not the explanation, not the excuse, but the expectation underneath it. You always understood. He hadn't come to apologize, he had come to renegotiate. He wanted me back in the penthouse, back in the arrangement, back in the dark, because the infrastructure I provided was expensive to replace, and he had discovered, in 4 days without me, exactly how much of his private life I had been holding together. I let him finish. Then I asked him one question, just one. In 7 years, Ethan, was there ever a plan, an actual plan, with a date attached, where you were going to take my hand in a room full of people? He opened his mouth. He closed it. That was the answer. That was the only answer that moment ever needed. I put $20 on the table for the coffee, stood up and told him I wished him well with the consortium. I meant it. Then I walked out of that cafe and didn't look back, and the feeling in my chest was not grief. It was done. I want to tell you about Marcus Osei. I didn't go looking for him. I need to say that because the timing sounds convenient, and I want you to know it wasn't a strategy. I was not so calculated as to manufacture a replacement. I was, in the weeks after leaving, doing the thing I had promised myself in that hotel room, learning what Kelvin looks like when Kelvin is the priority, reconnecting with a professional network I'd let go quiet, Meeting with two people who had tried to recruit me years ago and whom I had declined for reasons that now seemed faintly absurd. One of those meetings was at a rooftop event hosted by Osei Capital, a private equity firm that had been aggressively reshaping infrastructure investment across 3 continents. Marcus Osei, its founder and CEO, is 41 years old, American-British, and built his firm from the ground up with a philosophy so fundamentally different from Ethan's that being in the same room with him felt like breathing different air. Where Ethan's power was performed and carefully staged, Marcus's was simply present, grounded. The kind of man who doesn't need a room to know he's arrived. He's already been there. He was introduced to me by a mutual contact who described me as the most competent private operations manager nobody's heard of yet. Marcus looked at me with a directness I had forgotten was possible and said, "That sounds like a resource allocation problem. Why hasn't anyone heard of you?" I told him I had been otherwise occupied. He smiled and said, "Well, you're unoccupied now. Let's talk." We talked for 2 hours about infrastructure, about financial architecture, about the gap between how companies present their private operations and how those operations actually function. He asked questions that proved he had been listening. Actually listening, not performing interest while waiting for his turn to speak. He had a sharpness that was nothing like Ethan's. Ethan's sharpness was a tool for control. Marcus's sharpness was a tool for truth. He wanted to understand things. He wanted to understand me. I drove home that night, slightly stunned, not by attraction, though that was not absent, but by the specific, disorienting experience of being genuinely seen by someone in a professional context, of being asked about my capabilities with the implication that those capabilities had value on their own terms, not as a service to someone else's agenda. He called the next morning. Professionally, first, then, 3 weeks later, personally. And he was direct about that transition in a way that made me laugh for the first time in what felt like months. He called and said, "I'm going to be transparent with you because I think you've had enough of the opposite. I would like to take you to dinner. Not a meeting. Dinner." I said yes. He took me to dinner. He then took me to a gallery opening the following weekend where he introduced me to every person we encountered, not as a business associate, not with the careful ambiguity of managed distance, but with his hand at my back and my name in his mouth, and an ease so complete that it took me 3 introductions to realize what was happening. That the introduction was not an accident, that it was a choice made freely, and he was not calculating the cost of making it. On the 4th week, at an industry dinner attended by people who would have given Ethan Hale a panic attack in terms of their professional visibility, Marcus Osei pulled out my chair before his own, ordered the wine with a question directed at me first, and at one point during the meal, reached across the corner of the table and put his hand over mine in a gesture so natural and unguarded that the woman seated across from us smiled at it the way you smile at something that is simply, plainly good. I sat at a table full of people who could see me, and I thought, oh, this is what it was supposed to feel like. I found out about Ethan's response the way you find out most things you didn't go looking for. It arrived. A mutual contact, someone who had moved in Ethan's circles and mine simultaneously without fully belonging to either, sent me a message 6 weeks after the cafe. She had been at an industry function where Ethan had appeared. She said he had looked, and I'm using her exact word, diminished. The strategic engagement had apparently generated complications she didn't detail. The consortium partnership had stalled for reasons unrelated to image. The private financial architecture that I had managed, now requiring reconstruction, had produced several operational headaches that his official team was struggling to untangle. She also said, and this part I have read several times, that someone had shown him a photograph from the industry dinner. Marcus and I, at the table, his hand over mine, me laughing at something in a way that apparently photographs very clearly as genuine. She said Ethan had looked at the photograph for a long moment and then set it face down without a word. Then later that evening, according to her, someone found him in a side room of that event, sitting alone with a glass of scotch, and he was not performing, he was not managing. His eyes were red at the edges in the way that men who don't cry try to contain the evidence of having cried somewhere private. She asked me how I felt about that. I thought about it honestly.
I felt no satisfaction exactly, no triumph. Those emotions belonged to people who were playing a game, and I was never playing a game. I was loving someone. What I felt was something closer to the quiet recognition of a natural consequence. The specific, bittersweet justice of a person finally understanding the value of something only after they have made it permanently unavailable. He had 7 years to choose me. He can sit with that in a side room as long as he needs to. Marcus asked me, on a quiet Sunday 2 months in, sitting on the balcony of his home with the city below us and coffee between our hands, whether I was okay. Not performatively, not as an opener. He asked it while looking at me with the full attention he gives everything, and he meant it in the specific way of someone who understands that okay has a complicated interior and deserves a real answer. I told him the truth. I told him I was still in the process of learning to believe that what we were was real, not because of anything he was doing wrong, but because I had been trained for 7 years to treat love as something that existed most fully when it was hidden. That being in the open with him still occasionally gave me a strange vertigo, like a person stepping out of a dark room and needing a moment for the eyes to adjust. He listened to all of it without rushing to fix it. Then he said, "I'm not going anywhere, Kelvin. We can adjust to the light together. Take whatever time you need." I want you to understand what those sentences did to me. Not because they were grand or dramatic. They weren't. They were quiet. They were the kind of words that a person says when they mean them without needing them to be a performance. And I sat on that balcony and felt, for the first time in 7 years, that the ground under me was solid, and it was mine, and no one was going to revoke my access to it on the basis of strategic necessity. I cried on that balcony. Properly. The grief I'd been holding at the correct distance since the night of the gala finally arrived, and I let it. For the years. For the love that was real, even though it was wasted. For the version of 24-year-old Kelvin who said yes when he should have said, "Not like this." I cried for all of it. Marcus handed me his coffee, because mine had gone cold, and put his arm around me and said absolutely nothing, which was precisely the right thing. Ethan Hale's strategic engagement dissolved quietly about 3 months after the announcement. No public statement. The industry noticed. The press was briefly interested and then moved on, the way the press does when there's no fire to feed. He sent me a message once more after the cafe. A single line. I didn't know what I had. I read it. I put my phone down. I thought about 7 years. I thought about a man who understood leverage and narrative and the architecture of value, who had held all 3 of those things in his hand for 7 years and still couldn't see what was right in front of him until the moment it walked out of a ballroom with its back straight. I didn't reply. Not because I was being cruel, but because some sentences don't require a response. Some things you simply have to know too late and carry with you, and that is the entirety of what they deserve. I had somewhere to be. Marcus was picking me up in an hour. We were going, in public, to a dinner where people who mattered would see us together, and he would introduce me the way he always does, easily, proudly, with my name said clearly, and I would sit at a table that I was invited to, in a room I was allowed to be in, beside someone who chose me first, and loudly, and without a single calculation about the cost. I wore the Navy suit. It deserved a better night. Finally, it was getting one.